The highway was dark, the rain was merciless, and the SUV was already swallowed in flames. Inside that inferno was a woman who had 12 seconds left before the fuel tank ignited. And the only person close enough to save her was a man in a faded work jacket, a maintenance worker nobody had ever bothered to learn the name of. What happened next would shake a corporation to its foundation, expose a system that punishes quiet integrity, and prove that the most dangerous man in any room is often the one everyone chose to ignore. If stories like this hit different for you, stories about ordinary people carrying extraordinary weight in silence, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next on this channel. Drop a like if this one moves you, and leave a comment telling me your city and country. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. Now settle in, this one runs deep. The night the storm rolled in off the coast, Nathan Steele was running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the second hour of his shift. He was 40 minutes into the drive home when the rain really started coming down. Not the polite drizzle that commuters grumble about, but the kind of rain that makes the road ahead look like a gray wall, the kind that turns headlights into blurry smears on wet asphalt. His windshield wipers were doing their best in losing the argument. In the back seat, Emily was asleep. She always fell asleep in the car. Had since she was an infant, something about the engine hum, the vibration through the seat, the particular rhythm of highway driving. She'd curl her legs up, press her face into the corner of the seat and the door, and just go. Like a switch. Nathan used to joke about it with Claire, back when joking was still something they did together. "She's going to be the world's best road trip passenger," Claire had said once. "She'll sleep through every state and wake up just in time for food." He didn't think about Claire often when he was driving. It was too dangerous. Not emotionally, though that too, but literally, physically dangerous to let your mind slide that far sideways when you were doing 70 on a wet highway. He kept his eyes forward. The accident happened so fast that his brain processed it in pieces rather than as a single event. First, headlights in the oncoming lane veering, then overcorrecting. Then, the sound. A specific horrible sequence, tires shrieking, then the deeper percussion of metal striking guardrail, then something almost musical and wrong, the sound of a vehicle becoming briefly airborne. Then, the SUV. It crossed the median with a violence that seemed almost deliberate. The vehicle, a large dark-colored luxury SUV, the kind that cost more than Nathan made in 2 years, rolled twice in the air before it hit the shoulder of his side of the highway and landed on its roof, sliding 30 feet on wet asphalt before coming to rest against the concrete barrier. Nathan had already hit his hazards and was pulling onto the shoulder before the SUV stopped moving. He did it without conscious decision. The decision had been made somewhere in his nervous system, in whatever part of the brain handles this kind of calculation at speed. His foot found the brake, his hands found the wheel, his eyes found a safe gap between his car and the wreckage, and he put his vehicle there. He put it in park. He turned around and looked at Emily. She was still asleep, hadn't even stirred. Her mouth was slightly open, her hair fallen across her face, one small hand loosely curled near her chin. The car seat was secure. The door locks were engaged. They were 30 feet from the wreckage, behind the concrete barrier, out of any realistic path of secondary collision. He assessed all of this in roughly 4 seconds. Then he got out of the car. The rain hit him like a wall, cold, immediate, soaking through his jacket in the first 10 seconds. I was already moving toward the SUV, scanning for fuel spillage, for fire, for secondary hazards, building a mental map of exit angles and obstacle positions the way he'd been trained to do. Trained so thoroughly that the training had become reflex, and the reflex had become invisible even to him. The SUV was a wreck. The roof was crumpled down, the windshield gone, the driver's side door caved inward from the roll. There was a smell Nathan recognized, ruptured fuel line. The acrid sweetness of gasoline spreading across wet concrete, mixing with the rain but not diluting fast enough. And then there was the flicker, small at first, near the rear wheel well, just a tongue of orange licking at the edge of the undercarriage. It wouldn't stay small. Nathan moved to the driver's side, crouched, looked in through the collapsed window frame. The driver was a woman. She was suspended partially by her seatbelt, unconscious, headed at an angle that looked wrong but wasn't. He could see the rise and fall of her chest. Breathing, alive. A laceration on her forehead running into her hairline, bleeding freely the way head wounds do. "Hey," he said it quietly, more from habit than expectation. "Can you hear me?" She didn't respond. The fire at the rear of the vehicle was now the size of a large dog. Growing. Nathan assessed the door. No chance, too caved in. He moved to the rear passenger door. That one gave him more to work with. Bent, but not welded shut by impact. He grabbed the handle, braced his feet against the body of the car, and pulled. The door resisted. He pulled harder, changing his angle, putting his whole back into it. Something in his right shoulder sent up a flare of protest. An old injury from a training incident that had never quite healed right, and he ignored it the way he'd spent years learning to ignore things that didn't help the immediate situation. The door screeched open. He climbed in, leaned across the rear seat, reached the woman. Getting her seatbelt released was a problem. The clasp was jammed, belt pulled taut by the weight of her body. He worked the mechanism with his thumb, pressing hard, applying the specific pressure that sometimes freed a jammed clasp, and after 6 or 7 seconds that felt considerably longer, it released. She dropped toward him. He caught her, arranged her weight across his arms, and began working her backward through the rear door. She was not a small woman, tall, lean, but not someone you'd throw over a shoulder without your spine knowing about it afterward. He moved carefully. You never knew with accident victims. You never knew what was broken underneath the skin. The rear of the SUV was fully on fire now. He could feel the heat from 8 feet away. He got her out. He moved. 40 feet from the vehicle, then 60, carrying her with the deliberate controlled motion of someone who understood that dropping her on wet asphalt would be its own kind of damage. He got behind his own car, using it as a barrier, and laid her down on the shoulder, on her side, checking her airway with 2 fingers, confirming breathing, tilting her head slightly. The SUV's fuel tank let go 40 seconds later. The explosion wasn't cinematic. It wasn't a Hollywood fireball rolling into the sky. It was a heavy, concussive crump of sound, and a flash of light that lit up the rain and the concrete and Nathan's wet jacket, and then became a steady, intense burn that no one was going to survive proximity to. Nathan sat back on his heels. His hands were shaking. He noticed this the way he noticed his shoulder, as data, not as crisis. From the back seat of his car, through the rain and the closed windows, he could see Emily's silhouette hadn't moved. He pulled out his phone and called 911. He gave the location, the nature of the accident, the condition of the victim. He was precise and efficient because imprecision wasted the dispatcher's time, and he didn't think wasting people's time was a particularly admirable trait. He stayed with the woman until he heard sirens. He stayed because leaving an unconscious person alone on a highway shoulder in a rainstorm was something he was constitutionally unable to do. She came around briefly, just for a moment, eyes opening, unfocused, the confused look of someone whose brain was trying to load a page and failing. She looked at him without seeming to see him. "You're okay," he said. "You're out of the car. Help's coming." She said something. He wasn't sure what. Her voice was barely audible through the rain. Then she was out again. The paramedics arrived first, then a fire crew, then highway patrol. Nathan gave his statement to the officer. "Vehicle in distress," observed the rollover, stopped to assist, extracted the victim before the fire spread to the fuel tank. He was accurate and thorough and did not mention anything about himself that wasn't directly relevant to the officer's questions. "Good thing you stopped," the officer said. He was writing things down, not really looking up. A lot of people would have kept driving in weather like this. "Yeah," Nathan said. "You work in emergency services? Fire?" "Maintenance technician," Nathan said. The officer glanced up at him, a brief look, not skeptical exactly, just recalibrating. "Huh," he said, and wrote something else down. Nathan gave his contact information and went back to his car. Emily was still asleep. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, hands on the wheel, rain drumming on the roof. His jacket was soaked through. His shoulder ached. His coffee, when he picked it up from the cup holder, was genuinely cold now. He drank it anyway. Then he pulled back onto the highway and drove the rest of the way home. Emily woke up when he parked in front of their building. She always did, some internal sensor calibrated to the specific sound of their parking spot. "Are we home?" she said, the words blurring together the way 6-year-old words do when the mouth isn't quite working yet. "We're home," he he said. I had a dream about a dog, she said. What kind of dog? I don't know. Brown. It was running. Sounds like a good dream. He carried her up the stairs. She was too sleepy to walk, her arms around his neck, her head dropping against his shoulder. That particular weight of a half-sleeping child that is somehow heavier than their actual mass. He got her inside, got her shoes off without waking her fully, got her into bed. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. The nightlight was on, the one shaped like a crescent moon, with a slightly off-center glow that made the room feel warm rather than bright. Emily had one arm thrown over the edge of the mattress. Her hair was still damp from the car. Nathan watched her breathe for about 30 seconds. Then he went to the kitchen, found a mostly clean dish towel, and dried his face and hair as best he could. He hung his jacket over the shower curtain rod in the bathroom. He checked his phone. No messages. He set his alarm for 5:45. He lay down in bed without changing clothes because he was too tired to manage the logistics. He thought about the woman in the SUV, about the sound the door had made when he'd wrenched it open, about the way the fire had felt against his face at that distance, even in the rain, about the way she'd looked at him without seeing him, those few seconds of consciousness in the rain. He thought about Claire. He thought about how Claire would have asked him about it, not with alarm, but with that particular focused attention she gave things that mattered to her. Walk me through it, she'd have said, from the beginning. And she'd have listened to all of it, and then she'd have been quiet for a moment, and then she'd have said something that reframed the whole thing in a way he hadn't considered. She'd been good at that. He turned off the lamp. Outside, the rain was still going. He could hear it against the window, steady and indifferent. He got to Meridian Logistics at 7:49 the next morning, 14 minutes late. Not because he'd overslept, he'd been up at 5:45 as planned, but because Emily had woken up with a stomachache that may or may not have been real. The school drop-off line had been backed up 3 blocks for reasons that were never explained, and the parking structure at work had one of its gates stuck open, causing a backup. 14 minutes. In 4 years of employment, Nathan Steele had never once been sent home for being late. He had worked through a flu that put 2 of his coworkers in bed for a week. He had come in on his days off when equipment failed and no one else was answering their phone. He had worked a 16-hour stretch during a refrigeration system failure, alone, because his supervisor had decided the problem could wait until Monday, and Nathan had decided it couldn't. He had never once been sent home. He came in through the side entrance, went straight to the equipment bay, clocked in, and was pulling his work order for the morning when he heard footsteps behind him. Donovan Marsh had the particular walk of a man who had been given a small amount of authority over other people and had decided this made him architecturally important. He moved through the facility the way a weather vane moves in a strong wind, dramatically, and without much actual purpose. He was 43, heavy-set in a way that suggested his body was still trying to reconcile a younger self with current circumstances. And he had a habit of addressing subordinates from an angle, slightly to the side, as if the conversation were being observed and he wanted to look good for it. "Steele," he said. Not Nathan. Never Nathan. Nathan turned around. "Morning? You're late. 14 minutes. I had a school drop." Marsh held up a folder. It was a manila folder, the kind used for performance documentation. Nathan had never seen his name on one before. "I've been putting this together for a while," Marsh said, in the tone of a man unveiling something he was proud of. Attendance inconsistencies, unauthorized equipment modifications, failure to follow maintenance protocols. Nathan looked at the folder. He thought of several things to say. He said none of them. "We're going to have to let you go," Marsh said. "Effective today." The equipment bay was quiet except for the hum of the refrigeration units Nathan had recalibrated 6 weeks ago, which were now running at 11% better efficiency than they had been before. The floor was clean, cleaner than it had been when Nathan started, because he'd identified a cleaning protocol issue in his first month and quietly fixed it. The secondary conveyor belt, which had been making a sound that suggested imminent bearing failure, had been quietly repaired on a Thursday night when Marsh had already gone home. "The panel C repair," Nathan said, "unauthorized modification, was going to fail." He kept his voice level. "The primary drive shaft was seizing. I put it in writing 3 weeks ago. You told me it wasn't in the budget. That's not... I can show you the email." Marsh's jaw tightened. "This isn't about the panel. This is about a pattern of, you want me to clean out my locker now or after I finish the morning safety check? Marsh blinked. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected no argument, no plea, no attempt to negotiate. He'd prepared for pushback. The absence of it seemed to deflate something in him, and for just a moment he looked less like a man holding a folder and more like a man standing in a hallway he wasn't entirely sure how to leave. "Now," he said, "security will escort you." Nathan nodded. He went to his locker. He took out his extra work gloves, a small toolkit that belonged to him personally, a photograph of Emily that he'd taped to the inside of the door. He put them in a paper bag that security provided. He handed in his badge. He shook hands with Marcus from receiving, who had seen the whole thing from across the bay and whose face said everything he wasn't allowed to say out loud. He didn't make it a production. He didn't want it to be a production. He walked out. In the parking lot, he sat in his car for a moment. He had $4,200 in savings. His rent was $1,400 a month. Emily's school supplies and fall clothes were going to cost somewhere around $300. He had 2 months, give or take, before things became difficult. He pulled out his phone and started looking at job listings. He had a skill set. People who needed skilled maintenance technicians weren't exactly rare. It would be fine. It was going to be fine. He told himself this twice, sitting in the parking lot of a company that had just fired him for fixing their equipment, while a photograph of his daughter sat in a paper bag in the back seat. Then he put the car in gear and drove. The job listings weren't as promising as he'd told himself they would be. Nathan spent the first hour at the kitchen table with his laptop, a second cup of coffee, hot this time, actually hot, and the particular kind of focus he applied to problems that required patience rather than speed. I went through 4 job boards methodically, filtering by his certifications, his experience level, the commute radius that worked around Emily's school schedule. There were positions. A few of them were even decent, but decent and available weren't the same thing, and 2 of the 3 he flagged as strong fits required a start date that conflicted with a parent-teacher conference he'd already committed to and wasn't going to miss. He bookmarked what he could, wrote down 2 phone numbers, and closed the laptop. The apartment was quiet, in the way it only got on weekday mornings when Emily was at school. A specific, slightly hollow quiet that Nathan had never fully made peace with. He didn't mind being alone. He'd spent enough time in environments where solitude was a luxury you didn't get to want. But the apartment alone felt different from the apartment at 4 in the morning when Emily was asleep 15 feet away. The square footage was the same. The light was the same. Something else wasn't. He got up, washed the 2 cups in the sink, and stood at the window for a minute. The street below was ordinary. A delivery truck double parked, the driver unloading boxes without particular urgency. A woman walking a dog that was trying to investigate every crack in the sidewalk. 2 kids on bikes, school-aged, which meant they were either sick or skipping, and neither of them looked sick. Nathan watched the dog pull its owner toward a particularly interesting patch of concrete and thought about what he was going to tell Emily when she got home. He hadn't worked out that part yet. She knew, in the general way that 6-year-olds absorb the emotional weather of a household without being told specifics, that things were sometimes tight. She knew that some of her classmates had bigger houses and newer things. She'd never complained about it. She was Claire's daughter in that way, among others, possessed of a fundamental contentment that seemed to come from somewhere internal rather than from her circumstances. But she was also old enough to notice if he started being home every day when she got back from school, and she would ask because she always asked, and he wasn't going to lie to her. He'd figure out what to say. He always did. Ava Sterling woke up in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, with a headache that started behind her right eye and spread outward like a crack in glass. For approximately 4 seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then her brain finished loading and she remembered. The rain, the highway, something going wrong with the steering response, a sound she had never heard a car make before, and then nothing. A gap. White space where the next few hours should have been. She had woken up in the hospital at 2 in the morning, been told she had a moderate concussion, 3 bruised ribs, and a laceration on her forehead that had required 8 stitches and a small amount of swearing from the attending physician. She'd been unconscious again by 2:45. She'd slept through the rest of the night heavily, the way you sleep when your body has decided it's done asking permission. Now it was morning, and her assistant was already in the room. Jordan Kessler was 29, capable in the specific way that only people who've survived demanding bosses become capable, and had the look of someone who had been awake for several hours and was professionally pretending otherwise. He was sitting in the visitor chair with a tablet, 2 cups of coffee, and the expression of a man who had already made 17 decisions this morning and was waiting to be told which ones were wrong. "You don't have to be here," Ava said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "I know," Jordan said, and handed her one of the coffees. She took it. Hospital coffee, terrible, but hot and real and caffeinated. She drank half of it before speaking again. "What did I miss?" "The Dalton call was rescheduled. Your 2 o'clock is moved to Thursday. The board knows you're here." Patterson called twice. "I told him you'd call when you were ready and not before." He paused. "Your mother called." Ava closed her eyes briefly. "Did she know before the board?" "She called 4 minutes after Patterson, so technically yes, but barely." "I'll call her." She looked at the ceiling for a moment. It was the kind of ceiling designed to give patients something neutral to look at. Acoustic tile, a light fixture that buzzed faintly at a frequency just below annoyance. "What do we know about the accident?" Jordan shifted slightly. "Highway Patrol report says the vehicle experienced a steering malfunction at highway speed. Rain conditions. You went through the median." He stopped. "And?" "Someone pulled you out." He said it in a particular way, careful, like he was handing her something fragile. "Before the fuel tank went." Ava looked at him. "A bystander," Jordan said. "He stopped, extracted you from the vehicle, got you clear before the rear end caught fully. Left before the paramedics had a chance to get his information beyond a name for the police report." He glanced at his tablet. "Nathan Steele." The name didn't mean anything to her. She turned it over in her mind, the gap in her memory, the white space between the road and the hospital ceiling, and came up with nothing. She had a vague impression of rain and cold ground and a voice saying something she hadn't been able to make out. That was all. "Is there footage?" she said. "There are 2 highway cameras in that stretch. I already requested the footage." He met her eyes. "I figured you'd want it." "You figured right." The footage arrived that afternoon. Jordan set up a tablet on the adjustable tray over Ava's hospital bed, and she watched it with one pillow behind her back and her untouched lunch tray pushed to one side. The camera angle wasn't ideal. It was elevated, looking down at the highway at roughly 45 degrees, capturing a wide shot that made the cars look small and the guardrails look like lines drawn on paper. The rain showed up as a kind of visual static, a constant grain across the image that made everything slightly impressionistic. She watched the SUV cross the median. She watched it roll. It was strange watching a thing happen to yourself from the outside. The disconnect between the image and the fact that she had been inside that vehicle was significant enough that her brain kept sliding around it rather than engaging with it directly. She watched a sedan pull onto the shoulder. She watched a figure get out. He moved to the burning vehicle. That was the word. Burning. It was already burning when he got there. She registered this with a coldness that felt like a physical sensation. And then there was a period where the angle made it hard to see exactly what was happening. The camera showed him at the rear passenger door. It showed him working at something. It showed the fire growing at the back of the vehicle. Then he came out with her. She watched him carry her across the wet asphalt, and she thought distantly that she had no recollection of any of this, none of it, and the blankness felt like a kind of ingratitude she didn't know how to address. But it was what happened before that stayed with her. She rewound the footage, watched it again from the beginning, from the moment the sedan pulled onto the shoulder. She paused it at the moment the man got out of his car. He didn't go straight to the burning SUV. He stopped at the rear passenger window of his own car first. Stood there for a moment. The footage was good enough that she could see he leaned slightly, looking in. Whatever he saw, whatever he was checking, he stood there for what she timed at approximately 5 seconds. Then he turned and went toward the burning vehicle without hesitation. She watched it 3 more times. "Jordan," she said. "Yeah." "There's someone in his back seat." Jordan moved closer, looked at the tablet. "Looks like it." "He checked on them first, before he went toward the fire." She paused. "Someone was in his car and he left them to come get me." Jordan didn't say anything. He understood, she thought, that she wasn't asking a question. She set down the tablet. Her ribs ached when she breathed too deeply, a dull, persistent complaint. The laceration on her forehead pulled slightly when she moved her face. Outside the window, the sky was the flat gray of a day that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain again. Find out everything you can about Nathan Steele, she said. What Jordan came back with the next morning was not what either of them had expected. He sat down in the visitor chair and read from his tablet in the slightly careful way that meant he'd already read through it himself and had formed opinions he wasn't going to volunteer unless asked. Nathan Steele, 37. Born in coastal Virginia, the second of 3 kids. Enlisted at 18. Made it through Buttes on his first attempt, which Jordan noted was not particularly common, and Nathan had apparently told no one he'd done it at all, which Jordan noted was even less common. Served for 12 years. His record was classified above a certain threshold, but what was accessible indicated a level of operational experience that Jordan, who had done his research, described only as significant. Multiple commendations. Ranked among the highest performing personnel in his unit during his final years of service. He left the service 8 years ago. Jordan said it plainly and then stopped, and Ava understood without being told that there was a reason, and that the reason wasn't ambition or boredom. She didn't push it. People were entitled to their private grief. He had a degree, mechanical engineering, completed part-time while working, which Jordan pointed out had taken him 6 years because he'd been doing it around shift work and childcare. The daughter was named Emily, 6 years old. He'd been at Meridian Logistics for 4 years. His performance record there was, and Jordan's voice flattened slightly when he read this, a document of consistent accomplishment followed by consistent non-recognition. Maintenance reports showing problems he'd identified and flagged weeks before they became crises. Equipment logs showing repairs that extended machine life by measurable margins. 2 formal commendations from a supervisor who'd left the company 2 years ago. Nothing since. He was fired yesterday morning, Jordan said. Ava looked up from the window she'd been staring at. When yesterday? Jordan checked his notes. Approximately 7:50 a.m., 14 minutes after his scheduled start time. He paused. The night before, he'd pulled you out of a burning vehicle. The room was quiet for a moment. What was the reason? Ava said. Attendance and unauthorized equipment modification. Jordan put the tablet down on his knee. The modification was a repair to a primary drive shaft assembly that his own records show he'd flagged for replacement 3 weeks ago. He submitted a written maintenance report. It was denied. Budget concerns. He repaired it anyway, off the books, on a Thursday night. He looked at her directly. The cost of the repair was somewhere around $400 in parts in his own time. The cost of the failure he prevented, I ran the numbers based on their equipment specifications, would have been somewhere between $80,000 and $120,000 in downtime and damage. Ava pressed her fingers to her temple. Not dramatically, just a physical response to a specific kind of frustration that occasionally required somewhere to go. The supervisor's name, she said? Donovan Marsh. She had never heard the name Donovan Marsh before yesterday. She would not forget it after today. Pull everything we have on Meridian's acquisition timeline, she said. I want to know where we are. Jordan nodded, already typing. Ava had been considering the acquisition of Meridian Logistics for 7 months. The company was mid-sized, regionally significant, and strategically positioned in a distribution corridor that Sterling integrated, the company she'd built from a regional freight consultancy into a national logistics operation over the past 8 years, needed access to. The acquisition made sense on paper, had made sense for most of those 7 months, but Meridian's internal financials had raised enough questions that her team had been taking it slowly. The questions were still there. The financials still had problems. But Ava had spent enough time in this industry to understand that the numbers on a spreadsheet told you what a company was worth. The people in the building told you what it was. She called her COO from the hospital room that afternoon. Marcus Webb had been with her for 6 years, was constitutionally opposed to rushing things, and had the particular gift of knowing when not to say "I told you so" out loud. I want to accelerate the Meridian timeline, she said. There was a pause on the other end. Define accelerate. I want to be in a position to move within 3 weeks, 4 at the outside. Another pause. That's aggressive. I know. The due diligence on their operational, I'm not skipping due diligence, I'm compressing the timeline. There's a difference. She shifted against her pillow. Her ribs complained. I need you to bring in the full assessment team. I want eyes on their operational protocols, their maintenance records, their equipment logs. I want to know what their infrastructure actually looks like versus what their reports say it looks like. That's a significant deployment of resources. Marcus, yeah, trust me. I was quiet for a moment. Marcus Webb had known her long enough to understand when she was making an emotional decision and when she was making a calculated one that looked emotional from the outside. He also knew her well enough to know that even her emotional decisions usually came out right, though he had never said this directly and probably never would. I'll put the team together, he said. Thank you. After she hung up, she sat with the tablet again and watched the highway footage one more time. The angle, the rain, the small sedan on the shoulder. The figure that got out, moved to the back window, stood there for 5 seconds. 5 seconds checking on whoever was in that back seat, then turning and moving toward a burning vehicle without breaking stride. She thought about what that meant. Not the heroism of it, not the obvious surface of it, but the interior of it. What it meant that he'd been that calm. What it meant that he'd assessed the situation, confirmed whoever was behind him was safe, and then made the decision that most people, faced with flames at that range, at that intensity, would not have made. She thought about what it meant that he'd been fired the next morning, that the same hands that had dragged her out of burning wreckage had been handed a termination folder 14 hours later by a man who thought unauthorized equipment maintenance was a firing offense. She set the tablet down. She had a call with her lawyers in the morning, a follow-up with the doctor at 11, and her ribs hurt and her head still ached in that specific post-concussion way that made thinking feel like wading through something shallow but resistant. She picked up her phone and texted Jordan, "Get me an address." Jordan texted back in 11 minutes with a street address in a residential neighborhood, 22 minutes from Meridian Logistics. He added no comment, which was either professional restraint or the recognition that no comment was necessary. Ava stared at the address for a moment. She couldn't go yet. She was in a hospital bed, and her doctor had opinions about that, and she was not, despite various people's occasional impressions of her, actually the kind of person who discharged herself against medical advice purely out of impatience. She was the kind of person who stayed in the hospital when she needed to, while making plans she couldn't execute until she got out. She thought about a man sitting in a parking lot after being fired, with a paper bag of his belongings and a photograph of his daughter. She didn't know that was how it had happened. She'd built it from the details Jordan had given her: the daughter, the photograph, the particular kind of person who clocks in 14 minutes late after a night like that and expects things to be normal. She might be wrong about the details. She didn't think she was wrong about the person. Nathan found out about the Panel C situation the day after he was fired through Marcus from Receiving, who texted him with the particular brevity of someone who was using a work phone and was aware of that fact. FYI, the C conveyor failed completely this morning. They had to shut the whole east section. Marcia's telling everyone it was a previous maintenance issue from before your repairs. Thought you should know. Nathan read the text twice, then put his phone face down on the kitchen table and went to make Emily's lunch. She was at school. He dropped her off 40 minutes ago, and he told her simply that he was between jobs and would be home when she got back. And she'd looked at him for a moment with an expression that was too old for her face. That particular look she got when she was trying to figure out how worried she should be. And then she'd said, "Okay, Dad," and gone into school. He made a sandwich. He made it carefully, the way he did most things, even things that didn't require care, because the habit was built in at a level below conscious decision. Bread toasted lightly. Turkey, not too much. Emily didn't like too much. He packaged it in the bag she liked, the one with the stitching coming loose at the corner that he kept meaning to replace. He thought about what Marcus had texted him. The Panel C failure. The east section shut down. The machinery he'd fixed, that they'd fired him for fixing, now failed catastrophically because someone had undone his repair or declined to finish it properly, and the supervisor was already constructing a narrative that moved the blame backward in time to a point where Nathan was still responsible. He thought about whether he wanted to do anything about that. He thought about it for the length of time it took him to finish making the sandwich, and then he stopped thinking about it. There was nothing to be done that wasn't going to cost more in time and legal fees and emotional inventory than he could afford right now. He had 2 months of runway. He had job applications to follow up on. He had a call this afternoon with a facility manager in the northern part of the city who had a maintenance supervisor opening and who had sounded on the phone like someone who actually knew what the job entailed. He put the sandwich in the refrigerator and sat back down at the kitchen table with his laptop. He had a daughter to keep. Everything else was detail. Well, Ava was discharged from the hospital on the third day over the mild but outnumbered objections of her attending physician, who gave her a list of things she was not supposed to do and watched her face while she read it with the expression of a man who was under no illusions about which items she'd comply with. She went home, changed clothes, and called Marcus Webb before she did anything else. "Tell me about the Meridian assessment," she said. "We're 2 days in," Marcus said. "It's messy. Their maintenance logs are inconsistent in a way that suggests a combination of poor record keeping and deliberate obfuscation." "What does that mean practically?" "It means some of their reported equipment condition doesn't match the actual equipment condition, which in turn means the operational risks we'd be assuming in an acquisition are higher than their disclosures suggest." "How much higher?" "Working on that." A pause. "There's a notable exception." "Tell me." "There are a series of maintenance records, equipment logs, repair records, service notes, that are significantly more detailed and accurate than anything else in the system. Better documented, better tracked, better followed through. Our guys kept flagging them because they stood out." Another pause. "They're all associated with a single employee ID." Ava already knew what he was going to say. She said it anyway. "What employee ID?" Marcus read her a number. "Pull the name attached to that ID," she said. A beat. "Steele, Nathan A." She stood at her apartment window looking out at the city below, at the mid-morning traffic and the skyline in a flat haze of early autumn. Her ribs still hurt, her forehead still pulled at the stitches. She'd been awake since 5:30 because her body had decided sleeping past 5:30 was no longer something it did. "I need an address," she said, though she already had it. "I already have it," she said. "I needed to hear you say the name out loud." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to do what I think you're going to do?" "I'm going to go have a conversation," Ava said. "Should I?" "No," she said. "Not yet. This one I need to do by myself." She ended the call. She stood there another minute, looking at the city. She thought about the footage, the sedan on the shoulder, the rain, the 5 seconds at the back window. She thought about a man who had documented every repair, flagged every problem, submitted every report through the proper channel, been denied, and then gone ahead and fixed it anyway because it needed to be fixed. She thought about the East Section conveyor that had failed the day after he was fired, the one that he had already fixed, and that someone had apparently decided didn't need to stay fixed. She thought about a lot of things. Then she picked up her keys and went to find a man nobody had been paying attention to. The address Jordan had given her was in a neighborhood that existed in the specific category of places that were neither bad nor good, but simply honest. 4-story walk-ups with fire escapes that needed painting, a laundromat on the corner, a bodega with a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising a lunch special. The kind of neighborhood where people nodded at each other in hallways without necessarily knowing each other's names, where the parking on the street required patience and a certain tolerance for the particular art of parallel parking in tight spaces. Ava sat in her car for a moment before getting out. She was not a person who sat in cars. She was, by temperament and by the particular discipline that 8 years of building a company from nothing had installed in her, someone who moved from decision to action with minimal gap between the two. Sitting in cars thinking about things was not her natural mode. But she sat for a moment anyway, looking at the building. She was aware of several things simultaneously. She was aware that showing up unannounced at a stranger's apartment was not behavior she would normally endorse in herself. She was aware that her ribs still hurt when she moved the wrong way, and that her doctor had told her in plain language that she should be resting. She was aware that she had a company to run, an acquisition to close, a board whose patience with her hospital stay was already at its practical limit. She was also aware that the man who had pulled her out of a burning vehicle had been fired 14 hours later, and that the company that fired him was one she was in the process of acquiring, and that a certain kind of accountability required more than a phone call. She got out of the car. The buzzer panel in the vestibule had handwritten names beside each button, some of them faded to near illegibility. She found Steele, 3rd floor, and pressed the button. A long pause. Long enough that she was beginning to formulate a backup plan involving Jordan and a phone number. Then a voice through the intercom, flat and cautious. Yeah, Mr. Steele. My name is Ava Sterling. I think you may have met me briefly, though I was unconscious for most of it. Another pause. Different quality this time. She'd said the name, and the name had done something on the other end. How did you get this address? He said. I have a very good assistant and a legitimate reason for being here. I'm not going to stand in your vestibule and explain it through an intercom. A longer pause. The door buzzed open. Oh. I was waiting in the doorway of his apartment when she reached the third floor, and her first thought, involuntary, clinical, was that he didn't look like what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. He was medium height, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested use rather than gym time, with the kind of face that had been outdoors a lot and showed it. Not conventionally striking, the kind of face you'd pass on the street without filing away, which she suspected had suited him just fine for a significant portion of his adult life. He was looking at her with an expression that was careful in a specific way, not hostile, not particularly warm, just watchful, assessing. The same way he'd probably looked at every unfamiliar thing that had come through a door in the last 12 years. Ms. Sterling, he said. Ava, she said. You saved my life. I think that earns first names. Something moved across his face, not quite discomfort, but something adjacent to it. He stepped back from the doorway, a gesture that was clearly not enthusiasm, but was clearly an invitation, and she took it. The apartment was small and clean, with the specific tidiness of a person who had learned that disorder cost you time you couldn't spare. A couch, a coffee table with a library book, and a half-finished glass of water on it. A kitchen visible through a doorway. A child's drawing held to the refrigerator by a magnet shaped like a fish. No clutter for the sake of clutter. Nothing decorative that wasn't also functional, except for a photograph on the shelf beside the window. A woman, laughing at something off camera, clearly unaware the picture was being taken. He didn't offer her a seat right away. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at her with that careful, assessing look. How are you feeling? He said, though the way he said it suggested he'd rather be asking something else. Better than I should be, apparently. 8 stitches and 3 bruised ribs. She paused. You were careful with me, getting me out. The paramedics said there was no secondary injury from the extraction. That's not luck. That requires knowing what you're doing. He didn't respond to that, just looked at her. You didn't wait to be thanked, she said. There was no reason to stay. There was a reason, she said. You chose not to. He shrugged. It was a restrained shrug, the kind that meant this doesn't require discussion, rather than I don't care. The paramedics had everything under control. My daughter was in the car. I know. She held his gaze. I watched the footage. You checked on her first. That one landed. She could see it. A small shift in his expression, not defensiveness, but something quieter. He'd probably thought no one had noticed that part, or he'd thought no one would think it was worth noting. She was asleep, he said. I needed to confirm she was safe before I... He stopped. It was the right order of operations. I know it was, Ava said. That's why I'm here. She asked if she could sit. He said yes, and took the chair across from the couch, and they sat in the particular way of 2 people who didn't know each other well enough to be comfortable but were both too straightforward to perform otherwise. She told him what she'd found. She did it plainly, without the packaging of sympathy or the architecture of a speech. She told him about the footage, about Jordan's research, about Marcus's assessment team, and what they'd found in Meridian's maintenance logs. She told him about the Panel C conveyor failing the morning after his termination, and about the way his records were the only accurate ones in a system of deliberate or negligent obfuscation. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't perform surprise or outrage. He listened the way people listen when they already know the facts but are hearing the structure of them for the first time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What do you want from me? He said. I don't want anything from you. I came because you should know what the assessment team found. She paused. And because I'm accelerating the Meridian acquisition, and I'm going to be in that boardroom next week, and what happens there is going to involve you whether you're in the room or not. He looked at the window. The afternoon light was flat, coming through at a low angle that made the room feel later than it was. Outside, the street sounds were ordinary. A car, someone talking on a phone, a distant siren going somewhere. They'll reclassify the repair, he said. They already started. Marcus told me. I know they will. I have your original maintenance report, the one you submitted 3 weeks before the repair. I have the denial. I have the repair logs. She looked at him steadily. I have everything, Mr. Steele. Nathan, I have everything. He turned back from the window, looked at her with that same careful expression, but something in it had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more direct, like he'd decided something. The east section's going to have more problems, he said. Not just the conveyor. The secondary compressor in Bay 4 has been cycling wrong for 2 months. I wrote it up 6 weeks ago. If they haven't addressed it, the thermal load on the main unit is going to cause a failure within the next 3 weeks. Maybe sooner if they're running heavy shifts. Ava looked at him. I can give you the full list, he said. Every issue I flagged that was ignored, with dates. I would appreciate that very much, she said. Well, she left 40 minutes later with a 2-page handwritten list that was more technically precise than half the professional reports her operations team produced, and the specific feeling of having confirmed something she'd suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. In the car, she called Marcus. I need you to brief the acquisition team, she said. Full picture. Tell them we're moving. How soon? As soon as I can get the Meridian board in a room together. She could hear Marcus processing this, running his internal calculations. Ava, what happened in there? I had a conversation, she said. Set up the boardroom meeting, and tell Patterson I need to see him before it. The Meridian boardroom was on the 14th floor of a building that had been designed to communicate solidity, dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, a table large enough that the distance between seats was itself a kind of statement, the kind of room built for the performance of authority, which was useful right up until the moment someone walked in who didn't need the room to perform authority for them. Ava arrived 7 minutes early and declined coffee. She'd brought Jordan, her CFO, and Marcus, and she'd arranged for a projector to be connected to her laptop before she arrived. The Meridian executives filed in over the next 10 minutes, 5 of them, plus Donovan Marsh, who had apparently been included because someone had decided he was relevant. He sat to the right of the CEO, a man named Gerald Pratt, who had the look of someone who had run a company for a long time without particularly examining how he was doing it. Pratt opened the meeting with the expected language. Pleased to continue discussions, confident in Meridian's position, looking forward to a mutually beneficial arrangement. Ava let him finish. Then she said, Before we get into the financial framework, I'd like to show the group something. She pulled up the highway footage. The room was quiet while it played. Nobody said anything. There was something about the footage, the rain, the darkness, the quality of the fire at the rear of the vehicle, that made talk feel wrong. It was 38 seconds long. When it ended, Ava let the silence sit for a moment. The vehicle in that footage is mine, she said, 3 nights ago. She watched the room process that. Pratt's expression moved through several configurations. Marsh, she noticed, had gone very still. The man who extracted me from that vehicle before the fuel tank ignited is a mechanical engineer with 12 years of elite military service and 4 years at your company. She advanced to a still frame, Nathan at the rear passenger door, the fire already established at the back of the vehicle, visible, even in the rain. His name is Nathan Steele. He was a maintenance technician at your facility. Was. She chose the word deliberately. He was terminated the morning after this footage was recorded. She advanced her slides. At 7:49 a.m., 14 minutes after his scheduled start time, after taking his 6-year-old daughter to school, she pulled up the maintenance records. The originals, the ones Nathan had given her, cross-referenced with what Marcus's team had pulled from Meridian's own system. She went through them without theatrics, methodically, the way you present evidence when you want it to land as fact rather than argument. The Panel C documentation, the original flag, 3 weeks before the repair. The denial. The repair log. The termination notice dated the following morning. The assessment team's finding that the east section conveyor had failed completely on the same day, causing a shutdown that had cost Meridian approximately $94,000 in operational downtime. She put that number on the screen. The repair Mr. Steele was fired for performing cost your company $412 in parts, she said. The failure that occurred because the repair was interrupted cost you $94,000 in a single day. She looked at Marsh. He was looking at the table. Mr. Marsh, she said. He looked up. His face had the particular quality of a man whose prepared defenses have just become visibly inadequate. I've read your documentation for the termination. I understand you characterize the repair as an unauthorized equipment modification representing a pattern of insubordination. She kept her voice even. It wasn't hard. She wasn't angry in the way that required volume. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to what's on this screen. Marsh glanced at Pratt. Pratt was looking at the projection. He wasn't going to help. The repair was... There were protocols, Marsh started. The protocol he bypassed was a budget approval process that you denied him. Ava advanced to the email chain. The 3-week-old request. Marsh's one-line response. Not in the Q4 budget. Log it for review. He submitted the request. You denied it. He performed the repair because the equipment required it. He documented everything. She paused. What he didn't do was let a piece of machinery fail because a supervisor told him the budget was more important than the equipment. Marsh opened his mouth, closed it. Pratt said, Ava, Gerald, she said, and the use of his first name in that particular tone did what she needed it to do, which was remind him that she was not a guest in this room. I'm going to tell you what I'm prepared to offer for this acquisition, and then I'm going to tell you the conditions under which those terms will hold. She had his attention. She had everyone's attention. She laid out the offer. It was fair. It was real. It was the offer her team had prepared. It was not, she noted, the offer she would have made if Meridian's internal systems had been what their disclosures claimed. The gap between what she was offering and what they'd anticipated was significant, and she watched Pratt absorb that gap in real time. The operational risk profile of this company is substantially higher than your disclosures indicate, she said. Your maintenance infrastructure has been mismanaged to the point where Marcus's team identified 11 critical equipment issues in 2 days of assessment. 3 of them were flagged in writing by Nathan Steele over the past 6 months and not addressed. She put the list on the screen. Nathan's handwriting, transcribed into a clean document by Jordan that morning. This is what your best maintenance technician was telling you, she said. This is what he was ignored for. She let the room look at it. I want it understood that this offer is contingent on a full operational audit, completed before closing. If the audit reveals further material discrepancies from your disclosures, I reserve the right to renegotiate the terms. Pratt said, carefully, That's a significant change from where we were. Yes, Ava said. It is. Another silence, the kind that gathers weight. There's something else, she said. She advanced to the final slide. It was simple, but just text, a few lines. I'm not here to litigate employment decisions that predate the acquisition. Once we close, personnel matters at Meridian become my responsibility. She paused. But I want it on record, in this room, that the termination of Nathan Steele was unjust. That the documentation used to justify it was constructed from legitimate process violations that existed specifically because the legitimate process was being obstructed by management, and that the man who saved my life was working in a system that was actively hostile to the kind of competence and integrity he represented. She looked at Marsh one more time. I was not looking at the table anymore. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has understood, fully and finally, that the ground has shifted permanently beneath him. I want that on record, she said again, because the people in this room made a decision about who mattered and who didn't, and I think you should have to sit with the full picture of what that decision actually looked like. Pratt said nothing. Marsh said nothing. The window behind them showed the city in flat afternoon light, impartial and wide, and somewhere across that city, Nathan Steele was probably at a kitchen table with a laptop and a list of job applications, doing what he always did, which was the next necessary thing without waiting for anyone to notice. The meeting ended without the drama she suspected some of them had expected. No raised voices, no table slamming. Pratt said he'd need to consult with his board and his counsel, which was true and expected, and Ava said she'd need his response within 5 business days, which was also true and was also a deadline that left him no room to stall. In the elevator, Marcus stood beside her and said nothing for approximately 8 seconds. Then, the Marsh situation. I know. If we close this acquisition, when we close it. When we close it, he amended, his position becomes ours to handle. I'm aware of that. And? Ava watched the floor numbers descend. And I'll handle it the way I handle everything, with documentation and a clear record. She paused. The difference is that I intend the documentation to be accurate. Marcus made a sound that might have been the world's most restrained laugh. Okay, he said. They reached the lobby. Jordan was waiting near the door with her coat and a bottle of water and the expression of a man who had been monitoring his phone for the past 90 minutes. How did it go? He said. They heard what they needed to hear, Ava said. She put on her coat. Her ribs protested the movement, and she absorbed it without showing it. Outside, through the glass doors, the city was doing what cities do in the late afternoon, filling up, moving, the particular density of people who are all on their way to somewhere else without any of them being coordinated about it. She thought about Nathan in that boardroom projection, frozen at the rear passenger door of a burning vehicle, fire behind him, rain in front of him, doing what needed doing. She thought about the same man at a kitchen table, writing down equipment failures in handwriting that was precise and clean, because precision was how he operated even when nobody was looking. She thought about a 6-year-old named Emily sleeping in a car seat. She thought about what it meant that none of the people in that boardroom had known his name before today, that he'd been present in their building for 4 years, fixing their systems, carrying their equipment on his back, and not one of them had thought to learn what he was. She thought that was the part she'd had the hardest time sitting with, since Jordan had first put that file in front of her in the hospital room. Not the injustice of the firing, though that was real and would be addressed, but the invisibility that had preceded it. The way a person could pour 4 years of skill and care into a place and be so thoroughly unseen that the man in charge of his section had felt comfortable firing him over 14 minutes and a $400 repair that saved the company $94,000. She pushed through the lobby doors into the afternoon air. She had 5 business days before Pratt needed to respond. She had an acquisition to close, an audit to supervise, a board to update, and a COO who was going to need at least 2 more conversations before he stopped looking at her with that particular expression of controlled concern. She also had a phone call to make. Not yet. Not today. There was an order of operations to this. The acquisition had to close first, or anything she did would look like gratitude dressed up as business. And Nathan Steele had been accurate enough in their conversation that she suspected he would see through that framing immediately and reject it. She needed it to be real. She needed it to be defensible on its own terms, separate from the footage and the stitches and the weight of what she owed him. She got in the car. Jordan, from the passenger seat, said, "Where to?" "To office," she said. "I need to talk to HR about a job description." He looked at her. "Director of Technical Operations," she said. "I want to know what the role should look like before I know who's filling it." Jordan started typing. Ava looked out the window as the building that housed Meridian's boardroom shrank in the side mirror and then disappeared behind traffic, and she thought about a man nobody had been watching closely enough, and about how much damage quiet neglect could do to a person who was too disciplined to let you see it doing it. She thought about the 4 seconds at the rear of that sedan, the way he'd stood at his daughter's window, confirming she was safe, then turned without hesitation toward the fire. She thought about what it meant that he'd made that calculation fast enough that it looked like instinct, but slow enough that it was clearly a choice. Some people made the right choice when it was easy. Some people made it when it cost them nothing. Nathan Steele had made it at the edge of a burning vehicle in the rain, with his daughter 40 feet behind him. That, she thought, was a person you didn't find very often. And when you did, you didn't make the mistake of letting them disappear back into a parking lot with a paper bag and a photograph. She opened her laptop and started working on the job description herself. The call came on a Thursday. Nathan was under the kitchen sink at the time, replacing a supply line that had been weeping water slowly enough that he'd been able to ignore it for 3 weeks and had finally decided he couldn't anymore. Emily was at school. The apartment was quiet. He had a wrench in one hand and a flashlight clenched in his teeth, and was in the middle of reasoning with a fitting that had corroded just enough to make itself difficult without being difficult enough to justify cutting it out entirely. His phone buzzed on the counter above him. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He finished seating the fitting, confirmed it was hand-tight, and slid out from under the cabinet with the particular careful movement of a man whose lower back had opinions about confined spaces. He picked up the phone. Unknown number, local area code. He almost didn't answer. He'd been getting calls from recruiters for the past week. Not the good kind, the kind that had read his resume and thought maintenance technician meant he wanted to manage janitorial contracts. He'd been polite to 3 of them and had stopped answering unknown numbers after the 4th. He answered anyway. Some instinct. Nathan Steele, he said. It's Ava Sterling. A pause. I hope this isn't a bad time. He was sitting on the kitchen floor with a wrench in his hand and a corroded supply line fitting in the other. It's fine, he said. Give me a second. He got up, put the wrench on the counter, washed his hands. He was aware of a specific kind of alertness coming online, the kind that arrived when something was about to require his full attention. I have news about the acquisition, she said. Meridian. Yes, we closed the preliminary agreement this morning. Full close pending audit completion, but the terms are agreed. A beat. I wanted you to know before it became public. Nathan leaned against the counter. Through the window, the street was ordinary. A woman with a stroller, a delivery van idling. Okay, he said. Thank you for telling me. That's not the only reason I called. He waited. I've been working on something for the past week, she said. A position, Director of Technical Operations, reporting directly to me, overseeing the integrated maintenance and engineering infrastructure for Sterling Integrated and the incoming Meridian assets. She said it evenly, without decoration. I'd like to talk to you about it. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I'm not looking for your answer right now, she said. I'm asking if you'll come in and have a conversation. When, he said. Tomorrow, if you can, or next week, if that works better. I want you to have time to think about whether you're willing to hear the offer before you hear it. He looked at the counter. The wrench, the fitting, the flashlight he'd forgotten to turn off still glowing on the tile. Tomorrow works, he said. He told Emily that night, after dinner, while they were doing the dishes together in the particular assembly line system they'd developed. She washed, he dried, a division of labor she'd insisted on at age 5, and that he'd agreed to because she'd asked with the specific earnestness that made it impossible to say no without feeling like you'd done something wrong. Someone offered me a job, he said. A good job? She was scrubbing a bowl with more focus than it strictly required. I don't know yet. I'm going to talk to them tomorrow and find out. She considered this. Is it close? So you can still pick me up? That's one of the things I'm going to ask about. She handed him the bowl. What if it's not close? Then it might not be the right job. She looked up at him. That look again, the one too old for her face. Dad, if it's a good job, you can take it even if it's far. I can take the bus. You're 6. I'm almost 7. You're not almost 7. Your birthday is in 4 months. That's almost. He dried the bowl. Let me find out what it is first. Then we'll figure it out. She went back to the dishes, apparently satisfied. After a moment, she said, without looking up, Is it the lady from the accident? He stopped drying. What? The lady. From the accident. She handed him a glass. I heard you on the phone earlier. You said her name. Nathan looked at his daughter. She was watching the soapy water with the concentrated expression of someone who was asking a casual question and meaning a careful one. How do you know about the accident? He said. Marcus texted you and you left your phone on the table. She shrugged, very small. I didn't read it on purpose. I just saw the word. He didn't say anything for a moment. The kitchen was warm, the dish soap smelled like lemon, and his daughter was 6 years old and had apparently known something had happened and had been waiting for him to tell her. Yeah, he said. It's her. Emily nodded. Is she nice? She seems like it, he said. I don't know her well. But you helped her. I did. So she wants to help you back. She said it simply, without judgment or analysis, the way children state things that adults spend considerable time making complicated. Nathan handed her back the glass because he'd noticed a spot he'd missed. Something like that, he said. The Sterling integrated offices were not designed to intimidate, which Nathan noted because most corporate spaces at that level were. The lobby was clean and functional without being aggressive about it. The reception desk was staffed by a person who said good morning and meant it. The elevator opened directly into a floor that had the organized energy of a place where people were actually working rather than performing work. Jordan met him at the elevator. Nathan recognized him from the hospital, though they hadn't been formally introduced, and walked him to a conference room that was comfortable without being designed to make him feel comfortable, which was its own kind of comfort. Ava was already there. She was standing at the window with a coffee cup and what looked like a set of printed documents. and she turned when he came in with the expression of someone who had been thinking about this conversation and was ready to have it. She looked better than she had in the apartment. Still the stitches on her forehead, still something carefully managed in the way she held her torso that suggested her ribs weren't done complaining, but present in a way that the hospital and then the apartment hadn't quite allowed. This was her environment. He could see it in the way she stood in it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for calling," he said, and meant it in the specific way that acknowledged there were 100 things she could have done and she'd done this one. They sat. Jordan put a folder on the table in front of Nathan, the job description, he gathered, and then left, closing the door with the discretion of someone who understood the room needed to not have him in it. "Before we talk about the position," Ava said, "I want to tell you what happened in the Meridian boardroom." He listened. She told him about the meeting the same way she'd told him about the footage in his apartment, plainly, without softening it or dramatizing it. She told him about the projection, about laying out the maintenance records, about Marcia's face when the documentation went up on the screen. She told him about the $94,000 number, and about the 5-business-day deadline, and about Pratt's response, which had come in on the 4th day and had been, in her assessment, the response of a man who understood that his negotiating position had changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Nathan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What happens to Marsh?" "When the acquisition closes, his position folds into a restructured operations management structure. His current role won't exist." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to pretend that's a coincidence." "Is it legal?" "Yes. The restructure is legitimate. It's what the integration actually requires. The fact that Marsh doesn't fit into it is partly structural, and partly because I'm not going to build something I care about around someone whose instinct is to protect his budget by firing the person protecting his equipment." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He wasn't sure what he felt about Marsh specifically. Not satisfaction, not quite, but something more like the specific relief of a calculation that had finally balanced. Marsh had made a decision with someone else's life and called it policy. Policy had caught up with him. That was as much as Nathan was going to let himself want from it. "Okay," he said. Ava slid the folder toward him. "Read through that. I want to tell you what I'm thinking, and I want you to tell me where I'm wrong." He opened the folder. The job description was real, not constructed around him specifically, or not only around him, but built from a genuine operational need. Director of Technical Operations, reporting to the CEO. Scope covering all physical infrastructure, maintenance systems, and engineering protocols across 8 current Sterling facilities, plus the incoming Meridian assets. A mandate to audit, restructure, and rebuild. Team of 42, growing to 60 after the integration was complete. The salary figure at the bottom of the page was more than twice what he'd been making at Meridian. He read through the whole thing twice without speaking. "Where am I wrong?" Ava said. "The reporting structure," he said. "Reporting directly to the CEO creates a bottleneck. Operational decisions that don't require executive input will slow down if every escalation has to come to you." She nodded. "I'd considered that. What would you change?" "Dotted line to the COO for day-to-day operational decisions. Direct to you for structural changes, capital expenditure above a threshold, and anything that affects more than one facility." He paused. "And the threshold needs to be real, not a number that means everything comes to you anyway." "What number?" "Depends on your budget structure. Based on what I know about Meridian's capital allocation, which is limited, I'd start at 50,000 and adjust after 6 months once I understand how the integrated system actually runs." Ava wrote something. "What else?" "The team size is wrong," he said. "Too many?" "Too few. 42 people across 8 facilities is under-resourced if you're doing a real integration. You'll need at least 12 more in the first year, and they need to be actual engineers and technicians, not administrative staff classified as operations." Marcus said the same thing. I told him he was being pessimistic. He wasn't. She looked at him. Something in her expression, not amusement exactly, but something in that direction. "I'm getting the sense you're not going to tell me what I want to hear." "You didn't ask me to tell you what you want to hear," he said. "You asked me where you were wrong." "Fair enough," she said. A pause, the kind that meant they were moving from the professional to something adjacent. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, not diplomatically." Okay. Why did you come in today? Because you need a job? Or because you think this is actually the right fit? He considered the question the way he considered most questions, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. Both, he said. I'm not going to pretend the job search has been producing results I'm excited about. I have 2 months before money becomes a real problem, and most of what I've found is lateral or worse. He paused. But I also read that job description twice, and the second time I was already thinking about how to restructure the facility audit protocol. So, she nodded slowly. I need to ask you something harder. He waited. In my apartment, she said, when I told you about the acquisition and the footage and the boardroom meeting, you didn't ask me for anything. You gave me a list of equipment problems and sent me on my way. She set down her pen. Most people in your position would have seen an angle. The woman whose life you saved is the CEO of the company acquiring your former employer. There's a version of this where you make demands, where you let the obligation sit between us like a debt. I know, he said. You didn't. No. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Across the table, Ava was watching him with the same focused attention she'd had in his apartment, the kind that didn't need him to perform anything, just answer. Because I don't want to owe anyone anything, he said finally, and I don't want anyone to owe me anything. If you hire me because you feel like you should, that's going to be a problem for both of us inside of 6 months. If you hire me because you actually think I can do the job, then it's worth talking about. He met her eyes. I pulled you out of that car because it was the right thing to do. That's the whole of it. I'm not interested in spending the next 4 years collecting on it. She said nothing for a long moment. I'm not offering you this job because you saved my life, she said. I want that to be clear. You said that in my apartment. I'm saying it again because I want to make sure you heard it. She leaned forward slightly. I'm offering you this job because in 4 years at a company that was actively hostile to competence, you produced the only accurate maintenance records in their entire system. Because you flagged 11 critical issues in writing, with dates and technical documentation, and kept doing it even after you were ignored. Because the one time you bypassed a process, you did it to fix something that needed fixing, and you documented that too. She paused. You did everything right in a system that was doing everything wrong, and you did it without anyone watching. That's who I want running my operations. Nathan looked at the table for a moment, not avoiding her eyes, just needing somewhere to put the weight of what she'd said that wasn't her face. I have conditions, he said. Tell me. Emily comes first. Always. If I need to leave to pick her up, I leave. If there's a school event, I'm at the school event. If she's sick and the school calls, I answer the phone. I've built everything around her schedule for 3 years, and that doesn't change. That's not a condition, Ava said. That's a requirement I'd have included anyway. I'm not interested in building a leadership team out of people who've abandoned the rest of their lives. She paused. What else? I want full authority over the technical side. If I say something needs to be replaced, I don't want a committee. I want a budget and a process and the ability to move when movement is required. Within the thresholds we just discussed. Yes. Agreed. What else? I need to be able to tell you when you're wrong. She looked at him. You already did that twice in the last 15 minutes. I need to know that's not going to change after I sign something. I don't hire people to agree with me, she said. I hire people who know things I don't. If I wanted agreement, I'd talk to a mirror. A beat. Anything else? He thought about it. The Meridian staff, the technicians who are still there, the ones who are doing good work in a broken system. I want them evaluated fairly, not assumed to be part of the problem just because they work there. Ava nodded. I already told Marcus the same thing. The assessment team is doing individual evaluations, not blanket classifications. She paused. Marcus from receiving, specifically, the one who texted you. He's already flagged as someone to retain. Nathan looked at her. You pulled Marcus's file. I pulled everyone's file who appeared in the maintenance logs in any context related to your work. She said it without apology. I do my research. He sat back. The job description was in front of him, the salary figure at the bottom of the page, the conference room quiet around them. Through the window, the city moved in its usual indifferent way. Cranes on the skyline, traffic on the street below, people walking somewhere. I want to think about it, he said. I know. Not because I don't want it. I want you to understand that. I do understand that, she said. Take the weekend, talk to Emily, come back Monday if you want, or call me Monday if you'd rather talk first. She pushed the folder toward him. Keep that. He picked it up. He stood, and she stood, and they shook hands in the way that meant the conversation had been real and the question was still open, which was different from a handshake that closed things. At the door, he stopped. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. When you watched the footage, the part where I stopped at my car first, he looked at her steadily. Did you think I was going to drive away? She considered the question seriously. No, she said, but I think you considered it. For about 3 seconds, he said. I know. How do you know? Because you're not someone who does things without thinking them through, she said. And because if you hadn't considered it, really considered it, the choice wouldn't have meant anything. She held his gaze. The 3 seconds is the part that matters. Anyone can act on instinct. You acted on a decision. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and went to the elevator. Oh. He picked Emily up from school that afternoon. She saw him before he saw her. She came out of the building in the particular controlled chaos of end-of-day pickup, backpack bouncing, jacket half on, and spotted him at the edge of the pickup zone and changed trajectory without breaking stride, the way children navigate crowds through some internal sensor system that adults lose sometime in their 20s. How was it? She said, reaching him. Good, I think. She squinted up at him. She had Claire's eyes, Claire's particular quality of attention. What does that mean? It means I'm thinking about it. What are you thinking? He helped her get her other arm through her jacket sleeve. I'm thinking it's a good job. I'm thinking the person offering it seems like someone who means what she says. He paused. I'm thinking I've been doing okay on our own, and I want to make sure I'm doing this because it's the right thing and not just because the number is good. Emily thought about this with the gravity she brought to things she considered important. The number is good? Very good. She nodded slowly. Is it the kind of job where you get to fix things? Yeah, he said. A lot of things. Do you want to fix them? He thought about the job description, the audit mandate, the restructuring scope, the 11 flagged issues that nobody had addressed. He thought about 42 technicians across 8 facilities, working in systems that probably looked a lot like what Meridian had looked like. Not catastrophically broken, just steadily, quietly neglected until neglect became crisis. He thought about what it would mean to walk into that and actually do something about it. Yeah, he said. I do. Emily nodded again, more definitively. Then I think you should take it. You're 6, he said. Almost 7, she said. And I'm right? He took her hand and they walked to the car. The afternoon was cool, the kind of fall cool that arrived slowly and then stayed. And the leaves on the trees along the school fence had started turning at the edges in the way that always came faster than you expected. He called Ava on Sunday evening. She answered on the second ring. I have another condition, he said. Tell me. Emily wants a desk, in my office or near it, for after school so she has somewhere to do homework while I'm finishing up for the day. He paused. She's going to ask me if she can have a red one. I'm just warning you in advance. A beat. Then, I'll talk to facilities. You don't have to say yes to a red desk, she said, in or near your office. I'll make sure it's there before your first day. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Does that mean you're accepting? He looked around his apartment, the kitchen, the shelf with Claire's photograph, the window with the ordinary street below, the fish magnet on the refrigerator, Emily's drawing going slightly curled at the corners. Yeah, he said. I'm accepting. Good, Ava said. And then, after a brief pause that felt less professional than the rest of the conversation, I'm glad, Nathan. He said goodnight and put the phone down. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. The supply line under the sink was no longer weeping. The apartment was quiet with Emily asleep. The job description was on the counter, the salary figure visible from where he stood. He thought about 3 seconds on a wet highway. He thought about a burning vehicle and a calculation made under pressure, and the decision on the other side of it. He thought about what it meant to move towards something instead of just enduring where you were. He turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Emily the way he did every night, stood in the doorway for a moment in the nightlight's glow, confirmed she was breathing, noted the way she'd managed to migrate diagonally across the mattress in the 2 hours since he'd put her down, which she did with remarkable consistency. He pulled her blanket back up over her shoulder. She didn't stir. He went to bed. He didn't lie awake the way he sometimes did, running calculations, working through what-ifs, the particular kind of sleeplessness that arrived when the future was uncertain enough to require constant monitoring. The future was still uncertain. It was always uncertain. But there was a difference between uncertain and unknown, and for the first time in a while, he could see enough of what was ahead to let the rest of it wait until morning. Part 5. Louis, viết 5,500 to liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu liên mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liên mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện uyển ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, có quan điểm cá nhân, thông điệp, bài học, góc nhìn con người. Nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hội thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cầm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Phần 5 giải quyết hết vấn đề và kết thúc trọn vẹn câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhận không nhảy sang document. Sai đăng bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyền. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. Lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show More Part 5. The Quiet Warrior finally found his home. His home, the Red Desk, arrived on a Tuesday. Nathan found out about it the way he found out about most things in his first 2 weeks at Sterling Integrated, from Marcus Webb, who had an operational awareness of the building that bordered on the supernatural, and who had apparently decided, with no formal announcement, that keeping Nathan informed was part of his job description. Facilities put it in the corner of your office, Marcus said, appearing in the doorway with a coffee he hadn't been asked for and a tablet showing the day's maintenance schedule. Read, like she asked. Nathan looked up from the equipment audit he'd been working through since 6:45 that morning. Who told you about the desk? Jordan mentioned it. Jordan mentions most things. Marcus set the coffee on the corner of Nathan's desk and looked at the stacked folders with the expression of a man who respected organized chaos. Emily doesn't know yet? She doesn't know she's coming in today, Nathan said. She thinks I'm picking her up from school like normal. Marcus almost smiled. Almost. That's good, he said. Kids should get surprised more. He left. Nathan drank the coffee. It was better than the gas station variety, marginally better than the hospital variety, and significantly better than anything he'd managed to make in his own kitchen for the past 3 years, and went back to the audit. The audit was, in the technical sense, a document. In every other sense, it was an archaeology project. What Nathan had spent his first 2 weeks doing was excavating the actual condition of 8 facilities from beneath the accumulated sediment of inconsistent record-keeping, optimistic maintenance reporting, and the specific institutional habit of classifying deferred problems as monitored situations. He'd visited 5 of the 8 sites in person. He'd spent 1 full day at what had been Meridian's main facility, walking every section with a flashlight and a clipboard. Not because he needed the clipboard, but because people responded differently to a man with a clipboard than they did to a man simply looking at their equipment. What he found mostly was what he'd expected. Systems that worked, managed by people who were doing their best inside structures that made doing their best harder than it needed to be. The problems weren't usually the technicians. The problems were usually the distance between the technicians and anyone with the authority to act on what they knew. He'd sat in a break room at the old Meridian site on his 3rd day, eating a sandwich he'd packed, and a woman named Connie, who ran the night shift maintenance crew, had sat down across from him without asking and said, "You're the new director." "Yeah," he said. "Marcus from receiving says you used to work here." 4 years. She'd looked at him. She was in her 50s, with the kind of hands that had been doing physical work for decades, and the kind of eyes that did not have the patience for people who needed the conversation to be comfortable before they'd say what they meant. "So you know what it was like?" "I know what it was like when I left," he said. "Tell me what it's like now." She'd told him. For 45 minutes, through the rest of his sandwich and most of a coffee she'd produced from somewhere, she'd told him. Not with bitterness, exactly, but with the contained frustration of someone who had been watching problems accumulate past the point of personal tolerance and had long since given up expecting anyone to listen. Equipment maintenance windows that kept getting compressed to hit production targets. A parts ordering process so bureaucratically Byzantine that technicians were cannibalizing non-critical systems to keep critical ones running. Two people on her team who should have been promoted 18 months ago and hadn't been, not because they weren't qualified, but because the evaluation process required sign-off from a supervisor who no longer worked there and no one had updated the form. Nathan wrote all of it down. Not performatively. He wrote it down because he needed to remember it accurately, and he didn't trust himself to remember everything accurately without a record, and because Connie deserved to see that what she was saying was being treated as information rather than as complaint. When she finished, she said, "Is any of that actually going to change?" "Yes," he said. "Not all of it immediately. Some of it takes budget approval, and some of it takes process restructuring that has to go through legal. But the evaluation backlog that I can fix this week." She looked at him with the specific expression of a person recalibrating their expectations without fully committing to the recalibration. "Okay," she said. He fixed the evaluation backlog that week. Both of Connie's technicians received their reviews by Friday. That was how the first 2 weeks went. Not as a series of dramatic interventions, but as a steady accumulation of small corrections, each one requiring a different kind of effort, each one producing the kind of result that didn't look like much individually, but that people notice the way you notice when a persistent sound finally stops. Emily walked into Nathan's office at 4:15 on that Tuesday and stopped inside the doorway. She'd had the particular end-of-school day look she always had, hair escaping its elastic, jacket semi-deployed, a faint marker stain on her left wrist that she'd missed when she washed her hands. She'd said almost nothing in the elevator, which meant she was either tired or thinking, and with Emily those two states were sometimes indistinguishable until she spoke. She stood in the doorway and looked at the desk in the corner. It was a real desk, not a child-sized novelty, not something from a toy catalog, but a proper small desk, the kind a person could sit at and work. Red, the specific dark red she'd mentioned once in passing when talking about what color she wanted her room to be someday. A detail Nathan had passed along to Jordan without much expectation that anyone would track it down. Apparently Jordan had tracked it down. Emily walked over to it slowly. She ran her hand across the surface. She pulled out the chair. It was the right height, which meant someone had thought about this, and sat in it and put her hands flat on the desk in front of her. Then she looked at Nathan. "It's red," she said. "I know." "You remembered." "You mentioned it once," he said. "In the car." She looked at the desk again. She was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when something was bigger than she had words for yet. "I like it here," she said. "You've been here 15 minutes." "I know." She looked around the office, the stacked files, the whiteboard Nathan had covered in what was technically a maintenance priority matrix, but looked, he was aware, like the kind of diagram that required explanation before it looked like anything at all. It feels like a place where things get done. Nathan looked at his daughter sitting at a red desk in a corner of an office that was his, in a building where people were starting to bring him their problems because they'd learned he'd actually address them. And he thought about a parking lot and a paper bag and a photograph, and he let himself feel, for just a moment, the full distance between that and this. "Yeah," he said. "It does." He had been at Sterling Integrated for 6 weeks when the first real crisis arrived. It came, as crises usually do, from a direction he'd been watching but had expected to have more time to address. The secondary compressor system at the Meridian facility's consolidated cold storage unit. The same system he'd flagged 8 weeks ago in the handwritten list he'd given Ava, failed on a Thursday night at 11:47, taking temperature control offline for the entire cold storage wing. The wing contained product belonging to 4 different clients. Estimated exposure if temperature compromise extended past 6 hours, just under $200,000 in spoilage and contractual penalties. Nathan got the call at 11:52. He was asleep. Had been asleep for exactly 47 minutes, which was how he knew because he'd checked the clock when he'd turned the light out. He was dressed and out the door by 11:58. He called his facility's lead, a man named David Ree, while starting the car. "Talk to me," he said. David talked. Nathan listened, drove, and was already building a response sequence in his head. Temporary cooling measures, load redistribution, manual monitoring protocol, parts availability for the compressor component he'd identified 8 weeks ago as the likely failure point. "I ordered the part 3 weeks ago," Nathan said. "It should be in the secondary parts inventory, shelf 7, labeled urgent hold." A pause on the other end. The sound of movement, of someone navigating a facility at speed. Then, "It's here." "Okay," Nathan said. "Don't touch it yet. Wait for me." He was at the facility by 12:21. He spent the next 4 hours in the mechanical room with David and 2 of Connie's night crew technicians, replacing the failed compressor component, rerouting load through the backup system he'd had installed 6 weeks ago for exactly this kind of event, and managing the temperature restoration in a sequence that kept the product inside the safe range with 40 minutes to spare. At 4:30 in the morning, sitting on the floor of the mechanical room with his back against a conduit housing and a cup of coffee that David had produced from somewhere, Nathan looked at the system panel showing temperatures stabilizing across the cold storage wing and felt the particular exhaustion that comes after focused effort rather than the diffuse exhaustion of endless undirected work. Connie appeared in the doorway. She looked at the panel. She looked at Nathan on the floor. "You ordered the part before you even started," she said. "I flagged the compressor 8 weeks ago," he said. "Before I was technically working here, I knew what was going to fail." She was quiet for a moment. "And you ordered the part anyway, before anyone asked you to." "It was going to fail," he said. "Ordering the part was cheaper than not ordering it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You want another coffee?" "Yeah," he said. "I really do." Ava found out about the crisis the next morning from Marcus Webb before Nathan had a chance to brief her directly. She called him at 8:15. "I heard about last night," she said. "David should have called you when it happened," Nathan said. "That's a protocol issue I'll address." David called Marcus. Marcus called me. The chain worked, just not the way you designed it. A pause. "You ordered the part before you started." "The compressor was on the list I gave you in the apartment. I'd already identified the failure timeline." "So you ordered a part for a facility you didn't work at yet, on the assumption that you would, and that the failure would happen before anyone else got around to it?" "Yes." "That saved us roughly $190,000 last night. Closer to 200 depending on how the clients calculate the contractual exposure. I'd get your legal team ahead of that conversation." She was quiet for a moment. Not the processing quiet. A different kind. "Nathan." "Yeah." "How are you doing?" He was in his car in the facility parking lot, having not yet driven home, having not yet slept, having roughly 7 hours of work ahead of him that he was going to do anyway, because the crisis had generated secondary documentation requirements and 3 follow-up inspections that weren't going to schedule themselves. "I'm fine," he said. And then, because she'd asked in the way that expected an actual answer, "Tired, but the kind of tired that's okay." "Go home," she said. "Sleep for a few hours. The follow-up can wait until afternoon." "The inspections? David can handle the inspections this morning. You designated him as your operational deputy for a reason." A pause that had the quality of something thought through in advance. Part of the job is knowing when to let the structure you built do the work. He sat with that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay. I'll see you this afternoon," she said. "And Nathan, good work." He drove home. He slept for 3.5 hours. He picked Emily up from school at 3 and brought her to the office, and she sat at her red desk and did her homework while he finished the crisis documentation. And she complained once about a math problem that she said was unfair, and he looked at it and told her it was fair but showed her the part she was getting stuck on. And she said, "Oh," with the particular tone of someone who had just discovered a thing was obvious in retrospect, and went back to work. That was a typical Tuesday in the life Nathan Steele was building. 3 months in, the operational audit was complete. Marcus presented the findings in the Monday leadership meeting with the contained satisfaction of a man who had been cautiously optimistic and had been proven right to be only cautious and not pessimistic. Equipment failure rate across the integrated facilities was down 31% from the baseline established at acquisition. Response time on reported issues was down 60%. Two facilities that had been running at below capacity efficiency due to deferred maintenance were both back at full operational output. The numbers were real. Nathan had made sure of that, had built the measurement systems himself, had been careful to establish baselines before any interventions, so the comparison was honest rather than favorable, had resisted the temptation to take credit for improvements that were partly attributable to other factors. Ava looked at the numbers. Then she looked at Nathan. "What's the next problem?" she said. "Parts procurement," he said. "The vendor relationships are fragmented. We have 11 different suppliers for categories that could be consolidated to 4. That fragmentation is costing us time and money on every order. Fix it. It'll take 6 months and require renegotiating contracts that legal is going to have opinions about." "I'll talk to legal," she said. "You handle the vendor side." That was how their working relationship had settled into shape. Not without friction, not without the occasional direct disagreement that required one of them to defer and neither of them to pretend it hadn't happened, but fundamentally functional in the way that things are functional when both people have decided that the work matters more than being right. He'd told her she was wrong about a budget allocation in the second month, and she'd pushed back and he'd shown her the numbers 3 different ways, and she'd said, "Fine, your call," with the tone of someone who meant it rather than performing the concession. She told him his timeline on the facility in the Western District was too aggressive, and that he was going to burn out David Ree if he didn't redistribute the load, and he'd bristled, and she'd been right, and he'd adjusted the timeline and told her so directly without cushioning it, which she'd seemed to appreciate. They disagreed. They worked through it. The work got done. There was nothing romantic about it, or rather, there was something that might eventually be something. Something that existed in the space created by two people who respected each other enough to be honest, and were around each other enough that the honesty accumulated into a particular kind of knowing. But Nathan was in no hurry, and Ava didn't seem to be either, and neither of them was the kind of person to force a shape onto something before it was ready to hold one. What existed was real. What it was going to be could wait. He ran into Donovan Marsh once. It was at a gas station, 4 months after Nathan had started at Sterling, 5 months after the termination. Marsh was at the pump 2 spots over, wearing a jacket that was slightly less pressed than Nathan remembered, with the look of a man who was recalculating a lot of things he'd previously considered settled. Nathan saw him first. He thought, briefly, about getting back in his car and waiting until Marsh left. He didn't. He finished pumping his gas and walked over. Marsh looked up. His face did several things in quick succession. Surprise, something that wanted to be contempt and couldn't quite get there, and then something flatter and harder to name. "Steele," he said. "Donovan," Nathan said, first name this time. An uncomfortable pause. The gas pump clicked and hummed between them. "I heard you landed somewhere," Marsh said. "Sterling." "Yeah," Marsh nodded slowly. He looked like he was working out what to say next and was finding all the available options inadequate. "Look, you don't have to," Nathan said. You don't have to," Nathan said again. Not harshly, just clearly. "I know what happened and why it happened. I'm not carrying it." Marsh looked at him. Something in his face settled. Not gratitude exactly, but relief. And underneath the relief, something that looked like the beginning of a more honest accounting than the one he'd been running. "You were better at the job than I gave you credit for," Marsh said finally. It came out stiff and imperfect and obviously cost him something to say, which was probably why it was worth saying. Nathan looked at him. "I know," he said, not unkindly, just as fact. "Take care of yourself." He got in his car and drove away. He didn't feel particularly good about it or bad about it. He felt the way he felt after most things that required a decision in the moment. Like the decision had been made and was now behind him, and the space it had taken up in his attention could be used for something else. He thought about Marsh occasionally, in the months that followed. Not often. Not with anything that resembled active feeling. But occasionally, in the way you think about cautionary examples. Not as warnings, but as reminders that authority without accountability is just noise that hasn't found its consequence yet, and that the consequence always arrives eventually, one way or another. The thing about invisible people is that the invisibility is never really about them. Nathan had understood this in a general way for most of his adult life, but he understood it more specifically now, watching how people responded to him at Sterling. Not just the technicians and the maintenance crews, but the administrative staff, the operations managers, the people whose titles put them several rungs above the facility's floor and who had consequently spent most of their careers treating the facility's floor as infrastructure rather than people. They responded to him differently than they responded to most people in director-level positions. He'd noticed it starting in the second month and had spent some time trying to understand what caused it, because he didn't trust things he couldn't explain. What he eventually concluded was that it was the absence of performance. Most people in positions of authority, not all of them, but most, performed the position. They performed decisiveness, or competence, or busyness, or some combination. The performance was usually unconscious, usually benign, but it was there. The gap between what they were and what the title required them to appear to be. Nathan didn't have that gap, or didn't have it in the same way, because he'd spent 12 years in environments where the gap between what you actually were and what you presented could get people killed. He'd learned to close it not as a discipline, but as a reflex. What people responded to, he thought, was simply that what they saw was what there was. A technician named Ray on the Eastern facility crew told him once, bluntly, after 3 months of working together, "You're the first director I've had who came down to the floor when something broke instead of waiting for someone to bring you the report." Nathan had been on the floor because the break had happened and the floor was where the problem was. It hadn't seemed like a choice worth analyzing. "Someone has to see it directly," he said. "Yeah," Ray said. "Most people don't think that's them." He thought about that for a while. About what it meant that showing up in the place where the work was had become notable rather than expected. About the accumulated cost of that gap, not just in operational efficiency, not just in the kind of $94,000 failures that happened when problems went unaddressed, but in the human cost, the erosion of people who were good at what they did, spending years in systems that treated their expertise as interchangeable with someone cheaper and less experienced. He thought about Claire, who had been a pediatric nurse and who had talked about the same thing in different terms. The way the people closest to the patients were the last people anyone consulted about how to treat them better. He thought about how she'd been frustrated by that for her entire career without letting the frustration make her worse at the job, which was its own kind of discipline and one he'd always admired without fully understanding until he was trying to do the same thing himself. He brought it up once, obliquely, with Ava. They were in her office at the end of a day that had run long, the city outside the window doing its late afternoon thing, and the conversation had migrated from a procurement update to something less structured in the way conversations sometimes do when both people are tired enough to skip the professional scaffolding. "The people on the floor know things," he said, "things that never make it to this level. Not because they don't tell anyone, but because the structure doesn't have a real mechanism for the information to travel upward." "I know," she said. "The audit found 11 critical issues. All 11 were in someone's written report somewhere. All 11 were addressed by whoever received the report by doing nothing." "I know," she said again. She was looking at him steadily. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want to build a direct reporting channel, floor level to operations management with a response requirement and a tracking system. Not a suggestion box. An actual documented process where a flagged issue has to receive a response within a defined window or it automatically escalates." She thought about it. "Legal is going to want to put conditions on it." "I know. I've already talked to them. They have concerns about liability language, but they're workable." "How long to build it?" 3 months to design and pilot, another 3 to roll out across all facilities." She nodded. "Do it," she said. And then after a pause, "You know that's why I hired you." "The reporting channel?" "The fact that you walk into my office with the problem and the solution already in the same sentence." She looked at him. "Most people bring me one or the other." He didn't say anything to that. Understood what she meant, and he didn't have a response to it. That wouldn't sound like either false modesty or an acknowledgement that he'd been waiting for someone to notice, and neither of those was quite right. It wasn't that he'd been waiting, it was that he'd been doing the work regardless, and the work had eventually put him somewhere that the work could be seen. That was a different thing. But it was not nothing. Emily turned 7 in the spring. Nathan had been at Sterling Integrated for 5 months. The reporting channel was in pilot at 2 facilities. The vendor consolidation was 3 weeks from completion. The equipment failure rate was down 38% from baseline. He took the day off for Emily's birthday. Not a half day, a full day. The way he'd promised himself he would. The way he'd told Ava he would when he'd accepted the job. And Ava had said yes without hesitation and had made sure the calendar reflected it in a way that no one would schedule over. They went to the aquarium in the morning because Emily had been asking about it for 2 months, and he'd been saying soon and had privately set her birthday as the deadline for soon. She spent 45 minutes at the jellyfish exhibit, and he stood next to her and watched her watch them. The way the light moved through the water, the slow pulse of transparent bodies, the complete unhurried indifference of creatures that had existed for longer than anything else with which Emily was familiar. "They don't have brains," she told him. "We learned about it." "Yeah," he said, "but they know how to move. They figure out where the current is and they go with it." He looked at the jellyfish. "Is that what you took from the lesson?" "Ms. Patron said they respond to their environment. That's how they navigate." She pressed her hand against the glass. "I think that's smart. You don't always have to know where you're going if you know how to respond to what's around you." Nathan looked at his daughter. She was 7 years old and she was going to be fine. "I thought this not as a wish or a prayer, but as a reasonable assessment based on available evidence." She was curious and honest and possessed of a fundamental groundedness that no amount of upheaval had managed to dislodge. She was Claire's daughter in the ways that mattered, and his daughter in a few ways that he was still working out how to feel about. She was going to be fine, and he was going to make sure the environment she grew up in gave that fineness somewhere to go. "Yeah," he said, "I think that's smart too." They had lunch at a place she chose, a diner near the aquarium with a neon sign and booths with red vinyl seats and a laminated menu that had been designed in approximately 1987 and had not since been reconsidered. She ordered a grilled cheese and a milkshake and talked about the jellyfish for 20 minutes and then pivoted, without transition, to telling him about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend about the rules of a game that Nathan was not familiar with, and whose rules, as explained by Emily, seemed to shift based on narrative need. He listened to all of it. He asked questions. He ate his sandwich. This was the other part of the work, the part no job description could account for. Sitting in a booth with a 7-year-old who was trying to tell him something important about fairness by explaining a playground game, understanding that the jellyfish and the game and the milkshake were all the same conversation, the one about how you find your way in the world when the world is not always straightforward about what it wants from you. He was still learning how to have that conversation. He suspected he would be learning for a while. There is a particular kind of person that systems are not built to recognize. Not because those people are rare, they aren't, or not as rare as systems would have you believe, but because systems are built by people who are optimizing for legibility, and the most valuable kind of person is often the hardest kind to make legible. They don't announce themselves. They don't perform their competence. They show up, they identify the problem, they fix it, and they move on. And the only record of what they did is the absence of the failure that would have happened without them. Nathan Steele had spent most of his adult life being that kind of person. In the military, where the work was classified and the recognition was scarce, and the cost of failure was measured in ways that made corporate losses look abstract. In the apartment where he raised Emily alone, where the work was invisible by definition because invisibility was what good parenting mostly looked like. In a maintenance bay where he'd spent 4 years being the most competent person in the room and the least acknowledged, fixing things in the dark, writing reports that went unread, doing the right thing in the specific and unglamorous way that doing the right thing usually looked like, which was just doing it, over and over, without waiting for the circumstances to become worthy of the effort. He wasn't a different person now. The title had changed, the salary had changed, the scope of what he was responsible for had expanded significantly. But the fundamental operation was the same. Show up, see clearly, do the work, tell the truth about what you find. What had changed was the structure around him. And the structure mattered, not because it made him more capable, but because it meant the capability had somewhere to go. That, he thought, was what the past year had actually taught him. Not that he was worth more than he'd been paid at Meridian. He'd always known that, in the factual, unresentful way that you know things that are true regardless of whether anyone else has noticed. Not that the right person would eventually see him. The world was full of people who did the right thing in the dark and were never seen by anyone who could make a difference. And pretending otherwise was a comfortable lie that he wasn't interested in. What he'd learned was that structure could be built, that the gap between what a system was and what it should be was not a fixed condition, but a series of specific, addressable problems, and that addressing them required less genius than it required patience and honesty, and the willingness to be in the room where the problem actually existed, rather than the room where it was being discussed. He'd learned it from watching what happened when he created the direct reporting channel, from watching Connie's team flag 3 issues in the first 2 weeks that would have become crises by month's end, from watching the response time requirement produce results, not because it forced anyone to do anything, but because having a formal structure gave people permission to treat their own expertise as legitimate. People had always known. That was the part that stayed with him. The knowledge had always been there, in the people closest to the work. The structure had just never trusted them enough to give it somewhere to go. He thought about this often. He thought about it in terms of the company and in terms of his daughter, and in terms of the broader question of what you owed the world when you had the capacity to make something better. Not in the abstract, not in some grand declarative sense, but in the specific, daily, unglamorous sense of showing up and telling the truth, and fixing what you can fix, and being honest about what you can't. He didn't think he had answers to most of it. He thought he had a direction. On a Friday evening in late spring, Nathan stood at the window of his office while Emily sat at her red desk, finishing the last page of a book report she'd been working on for 3 days. The city was doing its end-of-week thing below them, loosening, people moving with the particular unhurried quality of people who have stopped performing being busy for the week and have not yet started performing being relaxed. Ava appeared in the doorway. She had her jacket and her bag, end of day, and she looked at Emily and then at Nathan in the way she'd developed of moving between the two of them in the same glance without making it strange. "How's the report?" she said. "Almost done," Emily said without looking up. She'd stopped being shy around Ava sometime in the second month, which had been abrupt enough that Nathan had noticed it specifically. It had happened during an afternoon when Emily had asked Ava, completely without preamble, what the hardest part of her job was, and Ava had sat down and answered for 12 minutes with the kind of honesty you didn't usually deploy at a 7-year-old. And Emily had listened carefully and asked 2 follow-up questions, and then said that does sound hard with genuine feeling, and after that they'd been fine. "What's it on?" Ava said. "Migration patterns," Emily said. "Birds, how they know where to go." "Do they know, or do they follow something?" Emily looked up. "That's kind of what the report is about," she said, with the tone of someone who had been wrestling with exactly this question. "Their instinct tells them the direction, but the specific path depends on what they find along the way." Ava looked at Nathan. He looked back at her. "That's a good report," Ava said. "I know," Emily said, and went back to writing. Nathan turned back to the window. The city spread out below them, ordinary and enormous, doing all the things cities do without asking permission or keeping records. Somewhere in it, Donovan Marsh was recalibrating. Somewhere in it, Connie's night crew was starting their shift, and the new reporting system had a blinking cursor waiting for anyone who had something to say. Somewhere in it, the things that were still broken, because the work was never finished, only continued. He was okay with that. He'd always been okay with that. The worth of a person was not measured in the absence of problems. It was measured in what they did with the ones they found. Nathan Steele had found problems his whole life, in the field, in a maintenance bay, in the specific and unrelenting problem of raising a child alone in the aftermath of loss, and he had addressed them with what he had available, which was attention and honesty and the refusal to pretend a thing was fine when it wasn't. It had not made him exceptional. It had made him reliable, which was rarer and more useful, and in the long run considerably harder to sustain. He was still sustaining it. Emily finished the report. She capped her pen and stacked her papers with the satisfied precision of a person who has completed a thing and knows it. "Ready," she said. Nathan got his jacket. Ava held the door. The 3 of them took the elevator down and walked out into the evening, into the city that was neither good nor bad but simply real. And they went to find somewhere to have dinner, which was the next necessary thing. And Nathan Steele did what he always did, which was exactly that, the next necessary thing, and then the one after that, for as long as it was required, which, as it turned out, was a very long time.